Moonshine Jesus, no bright sky. Moonshine Jesus, baby, alright. Moonshine Jesus, a surprising delight. Moonshine Jesus, won't you shine a light?
Hello and welcome to the Moonshine Jesus Show. Oh, wait, this isn't the Moonshine Jesus
What?
Show. What?
Wait.
This is Distilling the Gospel.
We're doing that again?
For Lent, we are repenting of not reading the Gospel.
Oh, shame on us.
Yeah, we've been...
For shame.
We know just how many people desperately depend on our brilliant insight from not doing any research on the Gospel.
I may not be able to talk the rest of the show now. I'm just going to laugh. Oh, God, yes.
So,
yes.
we have we have no problem with our sense of self-esteem. So it may be good that we're doing this during Lent.
Maybe so.
Anyway, Mark, I hope you're having a miserable Lent.
You know me, there's nothing I like better than being miserable.
For those of you who don't know Mark well, Mark hates Lent.
Hates Lent, that's strong.
Mark is not a Lent fanboy, shall we say?
Maybe Mark finds Lent dissatisfying and a little too dogmatic.
That's the purpose of Lent, to be dissatisfying and dogmatic. What part of that don't you understand?
You see my point.
So anyway, I'm forcing Mark to take on a Lenten practice because I'm an Episcopal priest, and that's my job, is to force you to participate.
That's right.
In Lent.
David says, if you're not going to be miserable on your own, I'll do it for you.
So we're going to read the Gospel. So we're going to. It is our goal to get back in the swing of this. So we do actually apologize for not doing this because we actually do enjoy this, and we know from feedback that people enjoy hearing us be morons about the gospel. So
it improves their own self image, how well they do when they hear us. And they go,
that's really, I think, the function. It's like pastoral care for preachers. They listen to our show and think, my sermon's so much better than what these guys said, and they have a podcast.
Well, that's right. They know I may be no scholar, but at least I'm better than those two idiots.
Exactly. So on that note, the gospel text for the first Sunday of Lent is the temptation of Jesus in Luke 4, verses 1 through 13.
Yes.
And as a new wrinkle, we're actually going to chant this together for Lent.
Do you know how many people just stopped the podcast now?
Anyway, so Mark, what do you do with this story? As someone who is probably not the greatest fan of Lent, this is still a pretty important story. Like it's in most of the Gospels.
Yeah.
It's in the Synoptics. It's a pretty important story. So how do you preach this when you preach this, whether it's Lent or not? What sticks out at you?
Well, I tell you what sticks out at me this time reading it through. I was really intrigued by the middle temptation. The devil let him up and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. The devil said to him, I will give you their glory and all their authority. And we like to think that these are temptations about power.
Yeah.
And so we tend to talk about that from that angle. But Jesus says that it's we'll only worship God. So this was actually not a temptation about power. This was a temptation to be misled, to have a false leader of some sort.
Yeah.
And I just found it interesting because I've heard that preached so many times about that the temptation was to seize the power of leading all authority over the kingdoms of the world. But that's not actually what the temptation there is.
Or maybe having that authority and all that power is itself a form of quote unquote devil worship.
Could easily be.
That's interesting. So what would you say to that? That it's placing your trust in a leader outside of kind of God, or
I think I mean, there's so many images of who we can understand and what we can understand God to be. Mm-hmm. And I would just go to the point of, I'd probably take it to the point of the understanding that God is love, and that's where we should place all the teachings of Jesus talk about loving each other, loving our neighbor, loving our enemy. I would put it to the point of, so if you're worshiping something other than God, if you're placing something other than love as priority in your life, that's the temptation that earthly power and earthly enjoyment puts in front of us, and that's the temptation, and that what we really should be doing is making sure that love is our highest priority.
I like that. Because we're in Epiphany when we were recording this, so the word glory catches my eye pretty big time.
Yes.
Because that's a big part of Epiphany. And so it's interesting for me to contrast the glory that he was tempted by and what the glory of God actually is. And so the glory, according to the temptation, is authority and being over people.
Right.
And so it's interesting to me to think about what the glory of God actually is, and that glory would be the antithesis of holding authority over someone in that way. So that kind of relates to what you're saying about love, because kind of the opposite of that is being with someone and walking beside them, journeying with them and loving. So I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think it, and then I just jumped to, how does that relate to the other two temptations?
Right.
And I'm working with that right now.
I mean, I think all of these are about popularity, about self-importance, comfort, and prestige, and kind of all that. And I think a lot of these do have to do with some form of power grabbing. Maybe not power, because I think there's power in love. It's just a different kind of power. This kind of authoritarian sense of power, hierarchical sense of power almost.
Yeah, I mean, power. The power of love comes from a place of having a humble understanding of yourself in relationship to other people, whereas the other power that we're talking about has to do with promoting yourself and prestige and being better. They are very different.
Yeah, there's this sense that, especially in the last two temptations, of this vertical nature of it, authority over and being on a pinnacle looking over. And so this kind of domineering, dictatorial kind of style of rule and ruling. I mean,
even the first one is a little bit of that when you think about it, because what it's basically saying is turn the stone into bread, so therefore you always have sustenance.
If you don't have to depend on anybody else.
And you're immediately placing yourself above all the folks who don't have sustenance.
Mm-hmm. Oh, man, that's a hard one.
Yeah.
Boy, I feel like that one probably resonates in our well-fed society probably more than...
particularly the weekend after Super Bowl.
Or the weekend of Valentine's Day.
Oh, see? Double whammy right there.
Yeah. Look, we can lay on the guilt on Lent.
Oh, aren't you happy? I cannot believe I just walked into that. Dang! How'd you do that? You are a sly one, man. You're the devil, and you're tempting me.
I'm an Episcopal priest. I know how to lay on the guilt during Lent.
I don't know, man. It feels like you're trying to do this really crafty playing out of temptation again. Okay, somehow you pulled me right into that.
Okay, so there's actually two things that I find intriguing and also a little disturbing.
Okay.
So if I read the last temptation, and I've never really thought about it like this in particular, that essentially Jesus is being tempted here in a way to attempt suicide, to throw himself off the pinnacle. And I find it incredibly disturbing to think of it in that way, to be quite frank, because the temptation is to trust God enough to throw oneself off a ledge. Right. Throw oneself off a cliff.
Sure.
In any other context, if we read this, this is suicidal ideation.
Right.
And that this is an actual temptation of Jesus means that there is some desire in there as well. And that's incredibly disturbing to me to think of it in that way. And I'm sure Luke didn't intend it to be something like that. But as I'm thinking about it, that's what comes to my head. And I'm not exactly sure what to do with that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting insight. I've never looked at it that way, because I always read straight into because the angel, it's written that the angels will protect you. So I've never thought of it as attempting suicide, but it's an interesting insight, and I don't know what to do with it either.
I mean, I don't think you could ever. I don't know if I would ever preach that. I think this is much better.
I think it's
a theoretical conversation to have with people.
I agree. What I actually do with that last part is I bring it into prayer, because a lot of the ways that we've been taught to pray is testing God.
That's true.
We pray for things to happen.
That God loves me if I get XYZ because of my prayers, or
Right.
God is really there if XYZ.
Right. Or we pray for something to happen or healing to happen, or and in a lot of ways that's testing God.
Yeah, that's true.
And Jesus says, do not put the Lord your God to the test.
I mean, and the reason why that's a test is because if you're testing God, you fundamentally don't trust.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a fundamental state of distrust. I mean, if you think of any of your relationships, if you're constantly putting your relationships to the test, you're fundamentally not trusting the person you're in a relationship with.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I completely agree.
So the last thing I want to bring up for me personally is that, and this just really grabbed me this time as I was reading the story. And that's one of the reasons why I love the lectionaries, because when you read these stories over and over again, different things grab you for different reasons.
Sure.
And this time, the thing that really grabbed me was that when the temptation was finished in the desert, the devil, the slanderer, departed until another time, opportune time. And so, of course, I'm hearing in my head Jack Sparrow from Pirates of the Caribbean talking about opportune moments, but it struck me that this was not the end in a very real way. That Jesus's temptations were not over. That Jesus didn't defeat his temptations here, and they no longer ended. So the same temptations that we see here would still have been present within Jesus' life. So, I took the time to kind of go through and think about, like, where do we see Jesus be tempted elsewhere in the Gospel of Luke? And I think it's fascinating to read through Luke. I mean, take the time to read through Luke and find echoes and resonances with these temptations to power or to prestige or popularity or to comfort. I mean, really and truly, he's on the Mount of Olives. He's praying for the cup of suffering to pass.
Right.
He's telling his disciples to purchase swords and to pack them as they go into Jerusalem. And then they're on the Mount of Olives, overlooking Jerusalem,
right?
Just like he was in that final temptation, right? And the Judas and the soldiers are coming to capture them, and the disciples ask him, Jesus, are we supposed to use our swords now? Do you want us to strike out?
Yeah.
And Jesus doesn't say anything. He doesn't say yes or no. He's completely silent. And so there's this moment where I think there's another temptation to power, to avoid that suffering, to get and it's not until actual violence happens that Jesus stops and says no more of this.
Yeah.
And so when viewed as like this continuation of the temptation, this no more of this is such a heavy phrase of the final defeat of this temptation. I don't know. Maybe that's a little too out there, but it's fascinating to me to think about. These are things that Jesus was actually tempted by. He really wanted these things.
I think that,
and so they would come up again and again.
Yeah, I think that until an opportune time, simply for me, I tend to read this story more as a parable.
Well, sure.
All right, and until an opportune time for me simply points to the real full humanity of Jesus.
Exactly.
To say
if he defeated temptation, all this temptation was just a charade. Was just a charade.
Right. Well, or that. Here's the reality. Here's an early setup of how Jesus is going to face temptations, just like all of humanity faces temptations. And yes, he defeats it, but it doesn't go away.
Yeah, exactly.
It comes back, and it's going to be a constant reality in his life.
So what if this story, we've been talking about temptation this whole time, what if this story isn't actually about temptation?
Maybe it's not.
What if it's about identity? Because you got to go, this story is actually directly connected to the proclamation of his identity in baptism as the beloved. So maybe this is really a story about identity and about wilderness and all that. And what do you do in the wilderness?
I think that's kind of where I was going to go next as well. Okay. Almost. Okay. I was going to say, what if this is a story about life journey, about understanding who you are and growing in it? Because this is the interesting part. So this is a story about being tempted in wilderness by the devil or by the tempter or by but
the slanderer.
But listen, so you would think that the devil is who pulls Jesus out into the desert, but no. Right. Jesus is full of the Holy Spirit and was led by the Spirit to the wilderness. Right. And so my question was going to be, what is it about this that's good and holy and a positive thing for a being And I think what you're talking about, and where I was going to go with it, is that we tend to think of as temptations as negatives, as bad things. But the reality is we grow through temptations. We understand ourselves. If we're somewhat reflective, we begin to understand ourselves better through temptations.
I mean, that's why a movie like Last Days in the Desert with Ewan McGregor is so cool, because Ewan McGregor plays Jesus out in the desert being tempted, but the person who tempts him is himself.
Exactly.
Is an image of himself. So you've got this great idea that it really is about identity, about discovering ourselves. I mean, if you're a Christian of any point of any length of time, you're going to find yourself in some kind of wilderness or desert at some point where you're trying to figure out who you are and you've lost your way maybe, or maybe
absolutely.
discovering your way. Mm-hmm. And so I think this speaks very deeply to the idea that this is an important part of our journey and of winnowing our identity and confirming our identity in a way. Because, I mean, when you connect it to baptism and identity, I think it's clear that the wilderness provides a very pivotal experience for Jesus, because immediately after that, he goes and begins his ministry.
Yeah, I agree. And, there's an interesting part that happens here that I'm just starting to think about is that, and this is going to be weird coming from me because it feels like I shouldn't be saying this. There's something else going on here about temptation and understanding yourself and character building. And that's that Jesus keeps responding with "it is written," talking about the biblical text, about the holy text, but the devil does the same thing on the last temptation, that that it's said or written that this is it.
Yeah.
And so there is something about the value of heritage and understanding who you are within that, but also at the same time showing that you can use that for either the temptation or for denying the temptation. And that says something about our biblical text and how we should be approaching them, I think.
Yeah, they're proof texting.
Yeah, and they both are.
And Jesus roots his understanding of the scriptures and the proof text that he uses in his understanding of who God is,
right,
as parent, father, the person
as love.
As love. So,
and I think that's an interesting part to say. If you're proof texting, what's the basis of it? What's the source behind the source? Why are you doing it? Are you doing it because you understand God is love? Or are you doing it because you're trying to manipulate somebody?
Everybody proof text. I don't care if you're liberal or progressive.
Of course you do.
Progressive or conservative. Eventually you proof text.
But that's exactly my point.
Because you do it as a shorthand.
Sure.
Because of who you understand God to be.
Right. But that's exactly my point, is that we all do. We can't not do that. We do that with any text that we're trying to understand. Yep. Of course we do that. The question is, what is the reasoning behind why you're doing it? Are you doing it because you understand that the larger concept is love and you're trying to find the places that show that clearly? Or are you doing it because you're trying to manipulate people?
And so I completely agree with you. And so that's why I think Lent is that. I'm going to pull it back to Lent just to mess with you. That's why I think Lent is great, because we do get focused on this giving up of things and this, I'm a terrible person and I'm sinful kind of thing. That's the legacy of Lent in a lot of ways in people's heads. But really, Lent should be a time where you do clarify your identity in a way in God, and you focus that. It's a time set aside that you can actually focus on that intentionally. And we should do that all the time, but we don't. Right. So for me, it's a good break to not to say I'm going to, punish myself or give something up or anything, but to figure out what I need to do to clarify who I am.
Right.
And kind of, maybe it's complicated things, maybe it's add-on things, but to really focus on remembering that identity, which is why at the Easter Vigil, we reaffirm our baptismal vows, because that's ultimately where, I get that identity from.
Right. Well, and if there's any value in Lent, it is that it's not biblical in terms of why we do it, but that
You're very biblical today.
I always am, a lot more than you are. You always want to throw crap out. No, I'm kidding.
I'm Episcopalian.
No, but one of the values of the way that it's practiced in a lot of denominations is that you're encouraged to give something up to understand the temptation. Unfortunately, we've allowed it to become that what's about is the suffering and the denying yourself. What it should be about is understanding how you as a person react to temptation and growing from that. There's value when it's handled that way.
I mean, and to figure out how we're
already... And it relates back to the story doing that way, and I apologize for interrupting.
No. And it reminds me that we're all kind of lost in the wilderness, and we're all kind of... And to find our way back, we have to kind of take the time to walk in the wilderness and to experience that wilderness in a very real way. Anyway, you keep going and going and going, but I think we've kind of we've tempted ourselves to talk more than we should. So I think we should resist the temptation to talk anymore, drop some tunes, and wish everyone a miserable Lent.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine. Let it shine. I won't let anybody blow it out. No, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah, I won't let anybody blow it out. I'm gonna let it shine. I won't let anybody blow it out. Oh, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.